Imagine two men, bitter rivals for their entire lives, who have fought in the streets, in business, everywhere. Now they stand in a dusty wasteland, thousands of miles from home, pistols aimed, ready to pull the trigger one last time. This was England and France in 1898, at a tiny, forgotten outpost in the middle of Sudan called Fashoda. Their colonial ambitions collided head-on. War seemed inevitable. The newspapers in London and Paris screamed for blood. For 1,000 years, this was the moment they had always prepared for. And then, nothing. They lowered their guns and walked away. Why? Because for the first time, they turned around and realized there was a much larger predator standing right behind them. This isn't the story of how a war ended. It's the story of how it became meaningless. To understand why they stopped, you have to understand the absurdity of how it all began. And it begins with a simple, uncomfortable truth. For the first few hundred years, the King of England was French. Not just French by ancestry, but a French nobleman who spoke French, lived by French customs, and most importantly, was a vassal to the King of France. When William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy, seized the English throne in 1066, he didn't stop being the Duke of Normandy. Think about that. It's like your branch manager suddenly becoming the CEO of a rival corporation, but still having to report to his old boss for his branch's performance. It was a feudal nightmare. The King of England was a sovereign in his own kingdom, but on the continent, for his vast and wealthy lands in France, he had to kneel before his rival, the King of France. This wasn't just politics, it was a personal, deeply humiliating contradiction that planted the seeds of a conflict that would last for centuries. This wasn't a war between nations at first. It was a family feud with armies. The Plantagenet kings of England were direct descendants of French nobles. They had legitimate claims to huge chunks of France. The conflict simmered for generations, erupting into outright war when the French Capetian dynasty died out. England's Edward III believed he had the strongest claim to the French throne itself, and he was willing to burn the world to get it. This kicked off the phase we now call the 100 Years' War. But it was never one continuous war. It was a series of savage, brutal campaigns that fundamentally changed both countries. At battles like Crécy and Agincourt, the entire French aristocracy was slaughtered, not by noble knights, but by low-born English peasants armed with the longbow. It was a weapon of mass destruction that upended the social order of warfare. For a time, it seemed England would actually win. An English king was crowned in Paris. But in trying to conquer France, England accidentally created it. France wasn't really a unified nation before this. It was a patchwork of duchies and counties. The idea of being French was secondary to being Burgundian or Gascon or Normand. The relentless English invasion changed that. And that change was embodied by a teenage peasant girl, Joan of Arc. She wasn't just a military leader, she was a symbol. She represented the idea that the land, the people, belonged to the French, not to some distant English-speaking king. When she was captured and burned by the English, they thought they were getting rid of a problem. Instead, they created a martyr and a national myth that fueled French resistance for the rest of the war. They had been fighting over feudal claims and inheritances. Now they were fighting over an idea, France itself. It was a war they could no longer win. By the mid-1400s, they were kicked out of everything but the port of Calais. Round one was over. France had won, but both nations were exhausted, broke, and fundamentally transformed. After a brief, exhausted pause, the rivalry found a new, much larger stage: the entire planet. The fight for a few French duchies was replaced by the fight for continents. This was round two, the Second Hundred Years' War. It was fought in the snowy forests of Canada, the sweltering plains of India, the sugar islands of the Caribbean, and on every ocean in between. It was no longer about who should be king of France, it was about who would dominate the world and its trade. This was a war of economies, of navies, of global supply chains. The British, an island nation, poured their resources into the Royal Navy. France, a continental power, had to maintain a massive army to watch its European neighbors, splitting its focus and its budget. This fundamental difference would prove decisive. The conflict peaked in what could be called the First True World War, the 7 Years' War. In America, you call it the French and Indian War. It was here that the British finally and decisively won the struggle for North America. On the plains of Abraham outside Quebec, the fate of a continent was sealed in about 15 minutes of brutal fighting. In India, Robert Clive's private corporate army outmaneuvered and expelled French influence, paving the way for the British Raj. Britain's naval dominance meant they could strike anywhere, reinforcing their own colonies while strangling France's. By 1763, the Treaty of Paris was a total humiliation for France. They lost almost their entire colonial empire. But Britain's victory came at a staggering cost. The debt from this global war was so immense they had to find new ways to tax their colonies. And that, of course, led directly to another problem, the American Revolution. France, seeing a chance for revenge, poured money and troops into helping the American colonists. They got their revenge. Britain lost its most valuable colonies. But in doing so, they bankrupted themselves, creating the perfect storm for the French Revolution. And then came Napoleon. If the rivalry had been a smoldering fire for centuries, Napoleon was a gallon of gasoline thrown on it. This was different. This wasn't a king fighting a king for territory. This was a revolutionary emperor, a military genius who represented a direct threat to everything Britain stood for: monarchy, tradition, and global trade. Napoleon conquered nearly all of Europe. He dismantled the Holy Roman Empire, humbled the Prussians and Austrians, and installed his relatives on the thrones of Spain and Italy. Only Britain, protected by the English Channel and the Royal Navy, stood against him. This was the final, desperate duel. It was a clash of titans, the whale versus the elephant. Napoleon's elephant, his Grande Armée, was invincible on land. Britain's whale, the Royal Navy, was unbeatable at sea. Everything came down to one afternoon off the coast of Spain in 1805. At the Battle of Trafalgar, Horatio Nelson didn't just defeat the combined French and Spanish fleets, he annihilated them. It was one of the most decisive naval victories in history. It guaranteed Britain could never be invaded. Napoleon, unable to cross the 20 miles of water, tried to crush Britain economically with his continental system, forbidding any nation in his empire from trading with the British. But he was trying to blockade an island that had already blockaded the world. Britain's global trade network, protected by its navy, allowed it to not only survive, but to finance coalition after coalition of Austrian, Prussian, and Russian armies to fight Napoleon on land. They paid for the wars that eventually bled him dry. From the disastrous invasion of Russia to the final muddy fields of Waterloo in 1815, Britain was the constant enemy, the paymaster of Napoleon's downfall. After Waterloo, the 1,000-year war was, for all intents and purposes, over. Britain had won. They were the undisputed global superpower. They presided over a century of relative peace, the Pax Britannica, built on naval supremacy and the Industrial Revolution. France, meanwhile, went through a chaotic century of revolutions and political instability. The rivalry didn't vanish, but it changed. It became a Cold War of colonial expansion and influence. They scrambled for Africa. They jostled for position in Asia. They were still rivals, yes, but the existential, to-the-death nature of the conflict was gone. They were like two heavyweight boxers, tired and bruised after 15 rounds, now just circling each other, too exhausted for another major fight. They were settling into their new roles, Britain as the global empire, France as the dominant cultural and land power in Western Europe. And then everything changed. While Britain and France were busy building their overseas empires, they took their eye off their own backyard. In the heart of Europe, a new power was being forged in blood and iron: Prussia. Under its brilliant and ruthless chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, Prussia systematically dismantled its rivals, Austria and then France, to unify the German states into a single, powerful empire. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870 was a stunning, catastrophic humiliation for France. Their armies were crushed in weeks, their emperor was captured, Paris was besieged and starved into submission. In the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, the very symbol of French power, the German Empire was proclaimed. Suddenly, France was no longer the preeminent land power in Europe. There was a new giant on the continent, and it was bigger, more populous, more industrialized, and it sat right on France's border. Now we can go back to that dusty outpost in Fashoda in 1898. The British expedition, having pushed south from Egypt, met the French expedition, which had pushed east from the Congo. 1,000 years of history said they should fight. National pride demanded it. But the world was different now. When the crisis reached the politicians in Paris and London, they weren't just thinking about a railway line across Africa. They were looking at that massive new German empire in the middle of Europe. Germany was building a navy to challenge Britain's. Germany had taken the provinces of Alsace-Lorraine from France and was hungry for more. Was a colonial spat in Africa worth a war that would leave both of them weakened and vulnerable to the real threat? The answer was a resounding no. France, facing the immediate danger on its border, backed down. It was a national humiliation, but a strategic necessity. The old rivalry was now a luxury neither could afford. Fashoda was the turning point. It cleared the air. Both sides realized their 1,000-year-old obsession was distracting them from a far greater danger. In 1904, they signed the Entente Cordiale, the friendly understanding. It wasn't a formal military alliance, but it settled all their outstanding colonial disputes. In Egypt, Morocco, and elsewhere, they agreed to stop getting in each other's way. More importantly, it was a public declaration that the rivalry was over. They were aligning against Germany. When World War I broke out 10 years later, that informal understanding became a desperate, bloody alliance. British Tommies and French poilus fought and died in the same trenches in Flanders, defending France from German invasion. The two fiercest enemies in history were now brothers in arms. The 1,000-year war had ended, not with a final battle between them, but with them fighting side by side against a common foe. They won the war together, but the cost was unimaginable. A generation of young men was wiped out. France suffered particularly badly. The war was fought on its soil, devastating its industrial heartland. Britain was financially ruined, transformed from the world's biggest creditor to its biggest debtor. They sat at the Versailles Peace Conference as victors, but they were hollowed-out victors. They imposed harsh terms on Germany, but they lacked the strength and the will to truly enforce them in the long run. They were old empires, tired and bleeding, trying to manage a world that was already slipping from their grasp. The war they fought to contain Germany had shattered their own power. If World War I was a mortal wound, World War II was the final blow. Again, they fought together against a common enemy, and again they were on the winning side. But when the dust settled in 1945, it was clear to everyone who the real victors were. The world was now dominated by two continent-sized superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. They had the populations, the industrial base, the military might that dwarfed the old European powers. Britain was bankrupt. France had been occupied and needed to be rebuilt. Their vast colonial empires, which had been the source of their power and the arena for their rivalry, were beginning to crumble as independence movements gained strength. The global stage they had once dominated now had two new actors who were so large they pushed everyone else to the sidelines. The moment this new reality became brutally clear was the Suez Crisis of 1956. When Egypt's leader, Gamal Abdel Nasser, nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain and France colluded with Israel in a secret plot to invade and take it back. It was a classic piece of 19th-century gunboat diplomacy. They were acting like the old imperial powers they once were. But it was the 20th century. The United States, furious at being kept in the dark and worried about Soviet influence, put its foot down. It didn't use guns, it used money. The Eisenhower administration threatened to sell its reserves of the British pound, which would have triggered a catastrophic collapse of the currency. Britain was forced into a humiliating withdrawal. France had to follow. It was a public, painful lesson. They could no longer act without permission from Washington. Their status as top-tier global powers was gone forever. Their old rivalry seemed not just irrelevant, but pathetic in this new world order. So what replaced the rivalry? A new project, the European project. After 2 world wars had torn the continent apart, the idea was to bind the nations of Europe together so tightly, especially France and Germany, that another war would be impossible. Britain was hesitant at first, still clinging to its imperial past and its special relationship with the United States, but eventually it joined too. The ancient enemies were now partners in a massive economic and political bloc. Their economies were intertwined. Millions of their citizens traveled, worked, and lived in each other's countries. The Channel Tunnel, a project Napoleon himself had dreamed of for invasion, was finally built to facilitate trade and tourism. The battlefields of Agincourt and Waterloo were now tourist destinations, visited by school children from both nations. Does this mean the rivalry is completely dead? Of course not. 1,000 years of history doesn't just evaporate. It continues today, but in a much healthier, safer form. It's there on the rugby pitch at Twickenham or the Stade de France, where the sporting battles are fierce and passionate. It's there in the jokes about food, the arguments over politics, the cultural one-upmanship. When Britain voted to leave the European Union, old tensions resurfaced over fishing rights and border controls. But this is the ghost of the rivalry, not the real thing. These are the squabbles of neighbors, not the existential struggles of empires. Nobody is preparing for war. It's a rivalry that has been domesticated, transformed from a duel to the death into a spirited debate. So, in the end, there was no final battle, no dramatic peace treaty that ended the 1,000-year war. It wasn't defeated, it was simply superseded. A bigger threat, Germany, forced them into an alliance. A new world order, dominated by superpowers, rendered their global ambitions obsolete. And a new project, the European Union, bound them together as partners. History is not a neat story with clear endings. It's a messy, overlapping process. The epic Anglo-French rivalry didn't conclude. It just faded away, like an old photograph left in the sun, its once vibrant colors bleached into pale shades of memory.
It became, for the first time in a millennium, irrelevant.
Let's dig deeper into that initial paradox, because it's truly the engine of the early conflict. The feudal system was a pyramid of personal loyalties. A knight owed service to a baron, who owed service to a duke, who owed service to a king. It was all based on oaths of fealty. When William of Normandy conquered England, he created a political black hole. As King of England, he was the top of his own pyramid. Nobody was above him. But for his lands in Normandy, he was still legally obligated to be a man of the King of France. This meant he could be summoned to the French court, was expected to provide military service to the French crown, and his inheritance could be subject to French law. It was an impossible situation. The English kings, with the wealth and power of a whole kingdom behind them, naturally resented being treated as subordinates. The French kings, for their part, saw their most powerful and dangerous vassal also happened to be their biggest rival. They used every legal tool at their disposal to undermine the English king's authority in France, constantly chipping away at his continental power base. Every dispute over a minor border or a marriage alliance was magnified because it was part of this fundamental, unsolvable power struggle.
We talk about the battles, but the real war was often economic. Sustaining these conflicts for centuries was ruinously expensive. Kings had to invent new forms of taxation, which often led to internal revolts. They had to borrow massive sums from Italian bankers. The English crown, in particular, was constantly on the brink of bankruptcy. This economic pressure had huge consequences. In England, the king's constant need for money to fight in France gave Parliament immense leverage. The Lords and Commons would only grant him taxes in exchange for more rights and privileges. You can draw a direct line from the financial needs of the 100 Years' War to the strengthening of English Parliament. In France, the threat of English invasion allowed the French king to centralize power, create a standing army, and impose taxes without the same level of consent. The war that began as a feudal dispute between nobles ended up shaping the fundamental political structures of both nations in opposite ways. One towards parliamentary monarchy, the other towards absolutism.
The conflict was also a relentless driver of military innovation. For much of the 100 Years' War, England had a decisive technological edge, the yew longbow. It could be fired 3 times faster than a crossbow and could punch through French armor at a distance. It was the machine gun of its day. The French strategy relied on the charge of their elite, heavily armored knights. At Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt, this tactic was a disaster. The flower of French nobility was mown down by English yeomen. This forced the French to adapt. They stopped seeking pitched battles and adopted guerrilla tactics, harassing English supply lines. More importantly, they invested heavily in the next game-changing technology: gunpowder and cannons. By the end of the war, French artillery was the best in Europe. The very thing that made English armies so successful in the early stages, staying in fortified positions and letting the French come to them, became impossible when those fortifications could be blasted to rubble by French cannons. The technological pendulum swung, and it helped seal England's defeat on the continent. We can't forget England's other perpetual enemy, Scotland. And for centuries, Scotland's greatest ally was France. The Old Alliance, first agreed in 1295, was a military and diplomatic pact aimed directly at England. Whenever England invaded France, the French would often call upon their Scottish allies to open a second front. This forced the English to constantly divide their forces, leaving troops to guard the northern border instead of sending them to the continent. It was a brilliant and effective piece of long-term strategy by the French. For the Scots, it provided a powerful friend to guarantee their independence against a much larger and wealthier neighbor. This alliance was a constant thorn in England's side and played a crucial role in the strategic balance of the wider conflict. It meant that England could never fully focus its resources on the French War, a distraction that France expertly exploited for hundreds of years.
Beyond the battlefields, the rivalry was also a profound clash of cultures and ideas. France, for much of this period, was the center of European high culture. The French language was the language of diplomacy and aristocracy across the continent. French philosophy, art, and fashion set the standard. England, on the other hand, developed a more commercial, maritime, and politically liberal culture. They saw the French as decadent, absolutist, and often Catholic, a major point of friction after the English Reformation. The French, in turn, often viewed the English as a nation of shopkeepers, culturally inferior and politically chaotic. These stereotypes, sharpened by centuries of propaganda on both sides, created a deep sense of otherness. They weren't just fighting an enemy, they were fighting a rival civilization whose values seemed alien to their own. This cultural dimension added a layer of bitterness and intensity to the conflict that went beyond simple dynastic claims. To truly grasp the shift, we need to appreciate the cold genius of Bismarck. He knew that the southern German states, who were culturally closer to Austria and France, would never join a Prussian-dominated Germany voluntarily. He needed a threat. He needed a war with France. He needed France to be the aggressor. The entire Franco-Prussian War was a masterclass in diplomatic manipulation. He provoked France over the issue of a German prince being offered the Spanish throne, and when the French reacted with blustering pride, he doctored a telegram, the famous Ems dispatch, to make it sound like the French ambassador had been insulted by the Prussian king. It was calculated to inflame public opinion in both countries. The French, led by the foolish Napoleon III, walked right into his trap and declared war. The southern German states, seeing France as the aggressor, immediately sided with Prussia. Bismarck got his unifying war, and in doing so, he created the very monster that would force France and Britain to forget their own differences and unite against it. The German threat wasn't just on land. Kaiser Wilhelm II was jealous of his grandmother, Queen Victoria's British Empire, and he believed that Germany's place in the sun required a world-class navy. This directly challenged the foundation of British power. For centuries, Britain's policy was to maintain a navy larger than the next two largest navies combined. The German naval laws of the early 1900s were a direct assault on this policy. An arms race began. Britain launched the revolutionary HMS Dreadnought in 1906, a ship so advanced it made every other battleship in the world obsolete overnight. Germany responded with its own versions. This naval race was incredibly expensive and created enormous tension. For Britain, a dominant navy was a matter of survival. It protected their food imports and their empire. For Germany, it was a matter of ambition. This existential threat from the North Sea did more to push London towards Paris than any diplomat could have. In the decades after World War II, both Britain and France had to manage the painful, often violent process of decolonization. They were no longer the masters of vast global empires. They were medium-sized European nations trying to find a new role in the world. This post-imperial hangover shaped their modern identities. They had to redefine their place on a stage no longer dominated by them. Sometimes this led to cooperation, as in the European project. Other times it led to friction, as with Charles de Gaulle's famous veto of Britain's entry into the European community, seeing Britain as a Trojan horse for American influence. These were the final embers of the old rivalry, playing out not over continents, but over committee rules in Brussels. The scale had shrunk dramatically.
So the story of how the Thousand-Year War ended is a story of replacement. A feudal rivalry was replaced by a colonial one. That colonial rivalry was replaced by the existential threat of a unified Germany, and that entire European power struggle was, in turn, rendered secondary by the global dominance of the United States and the Soviet Union. The world simply outgrew the conflict. The board got bigger, and new players emerged who changed the rules of the game forever. The greatest rivalry in history didn't get the epic finale it seemed to be building towards. It was simply, quietly, retired. What do you think? Is it possible for a rivalry that deep to ever truly die? Or is it just sleeping? Let me know in the comments below.